Namaste. I'm starting the talk. One, two, three. Manusmriti is a highly controversial subject. Over the past decades, rather even a century. So, on one side, there are people who want to burn down Manusmriti and they call it a symbol of all that is evil with Hinduism. It has caste discrimination, it advocates untouchability, it has reprehensible attitudes towards women, it is highly patriarchal, it is regressive, it doesn't have any relevance to the modern context. It is like there is a complete demonization of a text called Manusmriti, and there are people who just don't want to do anything to do with it. They want it banned. They kind of describe it as a book of evil. This is one extreme. At the other extreme, there are people who hold that Manusmriti is a great shastra. It is, it is beyond question, beyond criticism. It represents, it is very holy. This is a very small fringe among practicing Hindus, there are traditional and orthodox Hindus who think that Manusmriti is beyond question and it is very relevant today as it was during the ancient times, and they do not want to entertain any criticism or re-evaluation or reinterpretation of it. So these are two extremes. The rest of the Hindus are somewhere in the middle. So that is the vast majority. They are somewhat confused, somewhat bewildered. The whole debate looks very ambiguous to them. So what should be the ideal Hindu discourse given this controversy? Let us first evaluate Manusmriti as an ancient text. So, in this whole debate, it is not just one book. It is a representative of a group of texts called Smritis or Dharmasastras in the Hindu tradition. So these are the texts which can be called as the social and civil and criminal law books for the Hindus that have been traditionally followed. In some sense, they can be compared to the laws of Hammurabi, ancient law books of the Hindus. So that's what these Dharma Shastras are. And Manusmriti is not the only text. As it is true with everything Hindu, there is a wide range of diversity here. So there is Narada Smriti, Parashara Smriti, Yama Smriti, Vishnu Smriti. There are a host of Smriti books, and then there are Grihya Sutras and Dharma Sutras. There is a huge ocean of Dharma Shastra texts. So much so that P.V. Kani, the Pandurang Vaman Kani, has authored this famous 6-volume book called History of Dharma Shastra, which runs to 6,500 pages. So he was awarded Bharat Ratna for this monumental work on researching and analyzing the Hindu Dharma Shastras and presenting them. So it is a highly complex, highly voluminous, multi-layered textual corpus that we have got. So picking out one text, Manusmriti, of course, which has a very preeminent and predominant position among all the Smritis, which is true, and calling them as a upper caste conspiracy is nothing short of very ridiculous reductionism, so to speak. And then to characterize the entire Hindu tradition as Manuvadi, nothing but an upper caste conspiracy to keep the lower castes suppressed all the time in the name of the religion, and then extending this to the whole of Hinduism and extending it to the Indian nationhood, Indian nationalism, and the Indian state itself, saying that all this is Manuvadi and it is against Dalits, Adivasis, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe communities, etc., is nothing but, you know, it doesn't have any logical basis. And in this whole debate, Manusmriti has kind of become a hate object, a convenient stick to beat Hinduism down. And one argument that is said is that Dr. Ambedkar burned it in 1928, so he considered it as a something that is very objectionable. So let that be. Let us set that aside. If someone approaches Manusmriti with open mind, what do we find? It is a text of about 18,000 or so verses, and it has, as we already said, it's a multi-layered and complex text. So there are many lofty and noble elements as part of that, because it's after all it's a Dharmasastra, right? So for it attempts to organize the society based on the Varna system, an ideal society, stressing the rights and obligations for every social group and every individual. So it talks about Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and then there are some other communities which are even below Shudras. Occupation or birth based social categories, and then it talks about Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Sannyasa. So stages of life for each individual, and it has some very highly humanitarian concepts. So Manusmriti advocates property rights for women in the family, in the ancestral property. Dr. Ambedkar himself has recorded it and praised it, and it recognizes diversity to a great extent. For example, it recognizes 8 forms of marriages, not just the so-called arranged marriage and the love marriage, but even some of the other controversial forms of marriage. And when it comes to judiciary, it says that the local panchayats, the grama sabhas, so their dispensation of justice is very much recognized as an assembly of highly learned Brahmins or scholars who may be in the court of a king. So in that way, it recognizes the complete diversity and plurality that is there in the Hindu Dharma and the Hindu society. So these are the lofty and noble aspects. There are also aspects that can be called regressive, discriminatory. It has very disparaging remarks against Shudras, for example, in several passages. So if the Shudra happens to listen to the Veda, molten lead needs to be poured into his ears. If he utters the words of the Veda, his tongue should be cut. There are these kind of statements in Manusmriti, and there are passages that can be called irrelevant and obsolete. So it commodifies woman to some extent. It calls woman doesn't have independence. She always needs to be either under the protection of the father or the husband or the son. So after all, it's a very ancient text. And then there are aspects like about hygiene, public hygiene, etc. One should not pollute the water body. You should always filter the water using the cloth before drinking. So these have become what can be called as common sense wisdom these days. So it contains a mix of all these 3 aspects, Manusmriti or any other Dharmashastra text you take. And you will be surprised how flexible and how egalitarian some of its views have been. In one place, Manu says, Adadita param vidyam prayatnad avaradapi antyadapi param dharmam stri ratnam dushkuladapi. Learn the great supreme liberating knowledge even from a chandala, an outcast. Learn the great dharma even from a lowborn. If there is a girl who is like a jewel, stri ratnam, take her as your wife, even if she is of inferior descent, a low-born one. So this is what Manusmriti says. So in a sense, reading Manusmriti is like having a conversation with your grandmother or great-grandmother as a young boy. So you come across great wisdom, sound advice on practical matters, and some profound insight born out of her life experiences and the age and the trials and tribulations that she has gone through. And you also come across some highly prejudicial statements, towards some people, towards some communities, also some very outdated thinking, etc. But then, does one disrespect his or her grandmother for this? Would you call for burning down the picture of the grandmother because she is a mix of all these things? This is the outlook that we need to take towards texts like Manusmriti, I think, or any other Dharmashastra, or any ancient text for that matter. Coming to the objectionable content in the holy books, even if you compare Manusmriti with any other ancient text of that period, so historically it is dated to be somewhere around the 1st century CE or a couple of centuries before that, Manusmriti comes across as a highly sophisticated and nuanced text compared to other such ancient law codes across many other civilizations like Egyptian or Sumerian or Babylonian, Roman, Greek, any other Jewish cultures across the world. And historians opine that there is not much of evidence to substantiate that every other practice that is written down in the Manusmriti was ever implemented by the Hindu kings at any point of time in history. So just because there are some harsh punishments or prohibitions listed out in Manusmriti, it doesn't mean that they were actually implemented. It was more like some kind of a guideline, etc. So this point also needs to be borne in mind before we start criticizing Manusmriti. And coming to the objectionable content in holy books, the sacred texts of Christianity and Islam, many scholars have pointed out that they have highly objectionable statements against women, against non-believers, against the other people like infidels or kafirs. And these statements have been responsible for great crimes against humanity in history. And even now, they inspire terrorists and bigots to commit great violent acts. Those who call for burning Manusmriti, have they ever made any criticism or statements against these holy texts? These holy texts are foundational to these religions. They are the ultimate books. If you take Bible or Quran, they are the single most important holy books for those religions. But that is not the case with Manusmriti or any other Smriti or Dharmashastra in case of Hinduism. Because Hinduism has this clear divide called Shruti versus Smriti. So Shruti means the Vedas. It represents perennial, eternal wisdom, the timeless spiritual truths that don't vary across time or place. They are supposed to be, what is called apaurusheya, not man-made. It comes as some kind of a uh, divine utterance of the Brahman itself. That's a traditional position. Historically, you can say Vedas were composed by the rishis in ancient times. Whatever position that you take, whether it is orthodox view or the historical view, the Shruti represents the Vedas, and Smriti or like later texts which contains the codes, morals and ethics that keep changing according to place and time, and according to desha and kala and according to contexts. So these smritis take the shruti as their inspiration. So they also have a lofty and a respectful place in the Hindu scheme of things. But wherever there is conflict between Shruti and Smriti, it is the Shruti that takes precedence. If you take a text like Bhagavad Gita, which is considered as the sayings of Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself, it has a specific historical context of the Kurukshetra war, but it also contains timeless spiritual wisdoms directly flowing from the Upanishads. So, even according to tradition, a Hindu is not obliged to uphold or defend every word of Smriti at all times, neither during the ancient times nor during the modern times. We don't have such obligation to defend every word of Smriti texts, like the way a Christian or Muslim would defend the words of Bible or Quran. Only Veda is the ultimate pramana for even the traditional Hindu, orthodox Hindu. So given this, you may ask, does Hinduism need Manusmriti now? Or what is the relevance or position of Manusmriti for the Hindus, the sensible and thinking Hindus today? So if you go and ask this question to a Dharmacharya, a very traditional orthodox Hindu spiritual leader or scholar, he will say, oh, the Smriti needs to be accorded all the respect. It is a Pramana Shastra. So that is the conventional or standard answer that he will give. It's a stated position. But let us take this question a bit more in detail. So Manusmriti contains a lot of things. Let us take social laws, the civil laws and criminal laws, etc. So how can Hindus even follow the codes of Manusmriti? Is it even possible to follow? If a Hindu lives in India, he is bound by the Indian constitution and Indian penal code on these matters. If he lives in some other country like US, the constitution and laws of those countries, that's what would apply. And Manusmriti becomes totally irrelevant here. So there is no question of even following it. Let's come to the next level. So that is the secular aspects. Let's come to the spiritual guidance, Adhyatma. Does one need Manusmriti or any other Smriti or Dharmasastra for his spiritual life? Not really. We have great texts like Srimad Bhagavad Gita. We have Upanishads. We have Ramayana. We have Mahabharata. And there are many texts, bhakti texts and jnana and yoga texts written in many other Indian languages, like Jnaneshwari in Marathi, for example. That gives so much spiritual wisdom that is enough for Hindus to lead the spiritual life. How about moral, ethical guidance, like the dharma aspects? How should one lead? How should a householder lead his life, etc.? The so-called varnashrama dharma aspects. So in this aspect, Manusmriti has some insights. But there are other Hindu texts which have a far more balanced view on these topics than Manusmriti. For example, some of the defenders of Manusmriti say that nowhere Manusmriti has birth-based discrimination. The the Varna system of Manusmriti is not birth based. That's actually not true. Uh, if you take Srimad Bhagavad Gita, it says Chaturvarnyam Maya Srishtam Guna Karma Vibhagashaha. Bhagavan says the four Varnas were created by me based on guna and karma. That is a innate nature of a person and the action. But that's not what Manusmriti says. Manusmriti has a very, very clear birth-based framework all through the text. For example, it says that when a child is born in a household, if it's a Brahmana household, the child should be given names that are auspicious and denote peace. If it's a Kshatriya, the name should denote power and protection. For a Vaishya child, the name should denote wealth or prosperity. And for a Shudra child, the name should be contemptible and it should denote submissiveness. So there is clearly such discriminatory framework in the Manusmriti. If you take the Mahabharata, the Varnashrama is not like a frozen or rigid topic. In fact, all through the epic, there is so much debate. So in the Yaksha Prashna, when the Yaksha asks questions to Yudhishthira, there is a question as to how a Brahminhood, Brahmanatva of Brahmana determined. Is it by birth? Is it by learning? Is it by character? So Yudhishthira answers that it is not by birth. So there is, if you take the whole epic, there are characters like Drona, Karna, Vidura, Ekalavya, Sanjaya. So these characters are always at the boundary of the Varnas. For example, Drona was a born Brahmana, but he became a warrior. So he indulged in all the acts of a Kshatriya. So Karna was adopted by a charioteer, but then he wanted to become a Kshatriya. Vidura was a Dasi Putra. He was born to a maid, but he turned out to be a great Mahatma, the knower of Dharma, all through the epic. So this way, the Mahabharata presents it as a great discussion and a great debate, unlike Manusmriti, which presents it as a rigid and frozen framework. Same is the case with women. So when it comes to question about women, Manusmriti always presents a very rigid framework, but Mahabharata presents women like Draupadi, Gandhari, Kunti. They are very independent. No one can call them a submissive woman based on the Mahabharata. So even on these aspects, there are a lot more texts within the Hindu framework. And Manusmriti is just one of the so many multiple Dharmasastras that today's Hindus need to resort to know about Dharma. And what are really the objectionable points related to Manusmriti? Of course, it makes Varna totally birth-based, and it contains abominable and derogatory language against Shudras and those below them in the social hierarchy. It has regressive and restrictive attitude towards women. And by its very construct, as we saw, it presents only rules in the form of injunctions and prohibitions, no debates or discussions. So these are really the four objectionable points regarding Manusmriti. And as we just saw, where all it is not relevant. So where all Manusmriti is still relevant. So it is relevant regarding certain rituals. For example, in what age the Upanayana needs to be conducted. How the Shraddha ceremonies need to be performed. So the Dharmasastra texts have a very rich material on all these aspects. And for those who follow the Vedic rituals and ceremonies in a very traditional manner, the guidelines from the Smritis are absolutely necessary and essential. and they are very relevant. And as a academic text, you can certainly study Manusmriti. In fact, it gives so much insight about the ancient Hindu society, and it is as an academic text, Manusmriti is very much relevant. And then there are the fringe sections that I mentioned at the start of the talk, who say that Manusmriti is very relevant to today's life. Hindus need to lead their life according to Manusmriti. This is highly debatable. First of all, it's simply impractical for any Hindu, even the most orthodox person. If you read the kind of restrictions that Manu puts on how Brahmana should live, no Brahmana can live by the extremely rigid, extremely harsh restrictions. In fact, a Brahmana should not indulge in any occupation to earn his livelihood. If he should take bhiksha, if he takes bhiksha from the regular household in a normal manner, he is considered as the worst of the Brahmana. In fact, he should live off grains that have scattered from the trees. Such kind of mortifications, that tapasya that he needs to undertake. So that's practically not possible. And even for harmless things like leave alone harsh crimes, punishments, prohibitions, etc. What kind of girls one should not marry. So Manu says that a person should not marry a girl who doesn't have brother. He should not marry a girl who is named after a river or named after a star. So all those girls who are named as Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari, Kaveri, they are not to be married according to Manu. And girls named after stars like Ashwini, Anuradha, Chitra, Revati, Rohini, they are not to be married. And as we all know, Balarama's mother's name is Rohini. And the girl without a brother, she is not to be married. So Sita, Rama should not have married Sita because she doesn't have a brother as per the Ramayana. And of course, the defenders of Manu say that these are all optional injunctions and rules. But the point is, even some of the harmless injunctions of Manu sound so ridiculous and irrelevant, even for a very reasonable and a sensible person who wants to follow all the traditions, in his earnestness. So, all pre-modern societies, all pre-industrial societies had many such social discrimination practices and injunctions, but nobody says that they should be very, they are very, very relevant today. And when we come to the question of Pramana Shastra, so Smritis are Pramana Shastra, but Pramana for what? Certainly not Pramana for some of those things like social laws, etc. that I said. They can be Pramanas for some of the other things where they are reasonably relevant even today. So, what should be the ideal Hindu discourse regarding Manusmriti or Dharmasastra or any ancient text for that matter? No blind opposition, no blind demonizing of any text, because every ancient text has great value. It provides great insights. Certainly, no one should call for burning any text or totally rejecting them. No blind reverence or blind adulation, based on some kind of a fundamentalist streak. So what we should take is a very nuanced position based on a dharmic framework. So there should be a very good Hindu discourse for the overall benefit of the Hindu society today. So stress on the lofty aspects of all the Smritis and Dharmasastras. And don't get into defending every word or every sentence of Smritis, because even the tradition doesn't ask us to do that. So, based on Dharma and our conscience, create a discourse that will result in the overall benefit of the Hindu society. That should be our position.